This series is based upon and inspired by the 2021 series Squid Game, created by Hwang Dong-hyuk and produced by Netflix. It also features art created by the fabulous Andrew MacLaine. When the reactions of shock and horror to Player 69's murder have been fully quashed, each team is approached by a circle guard. Mr. Yellow then steps forward and instructs that the game which teammates will be playing together is Conkers. While surveying the range of expressions before him, Mr. Yellow instructs how over the next 5 minutes, every player must collect 3 Conkers from the forest. Mr. Yellow then informs that in each team, teammate A will be given 3 attempts to hit his Conker against teammate B's Conker. If teammate B's Conker remains intact, play passes to him, and he will be given 3 attempts to hit his Conker against teammate A's Conker, and so on. When a teammate's Conker breaks, or becomes detached from the string, he will begin his next turn with one of his other Conkers, unless he has no more Conkers, in which case he will be eliminated. The first teammate to lose all 3 of his Conkers will be eliminated, whilst the winning teammate will pass this game. Mr. Yellow asks if there are any questions. Receiving no response from the stunned crowd, he orders the circle guards to lead their teams in their assigned direction through the forest. Each circle guard takes out a small screened device from their jumpsuit, on which a satellite map of the forest is displayed. As the circle guards usher their players in a range of directions across the clearing, a few players from different teams try to communicate with each other, including Steve, player 98, who shouts over to Diane, player 96, and Mary, player 95. The women are escorted into the western side of the forest. Mary calls back to Steve, although he and Mike are swiftly led by their guard into the eastern side of the forest, and Diane still seems too dumbstruck to speak. The pairs of players are beginning to enter the tree line of the forest when Mr. Orange calls for their attention. They stop moving, and he reminds that each guard is armed with several guns, and after last night's incident, they won't hesitate to use them. Therefore, there is no point in even thinking about attempting an escape. Players hesitantly continue through the tree line, and Nicholas, player 173, eyes Yusuf, player 28, as they and their respective teammates are marched into the southern side of the forest. Nicholas and Jeff, player 171, are led down a southwestern hill by their short, stout guard. Almost immediately, Jeff is studying the branches of every chestnut tree they pass, with such precision that he nearly trips over several roots and slopes of wet earth. Nicholas, on the other hand, stays close to the guard and sporadically picks up a selection of fallen Conkers, recounting aloud several details of the last time he played this game, several decades prior. A minute later, Jeff spots some Conkers in a slender chestnut tree to his left, and declares them to be suitable. After watching him reach up to the nearest branch, Nicholas briskly walks round a nearby cluster of bent trees. Nicholas beckons the guard to come over, and holds out his hand expectantly. The guard removes a pouch from her pocket, from which she extracts 3 firm, shiny and sizable Conkers. Nicholas grins and inhales, quietly asking, "Oven-baked and vinegar?" The guard nods, and inquires, "$500,000, right?" Nicholas nods, and drops his previously collected Conkers, before taking the 3 from the guard's pouch. Meanwhile, an older female guard is ushering Steve and Mike through the east of the forest, alongside a shallow stream. Steve repeatedly looks back over his shoulder, with a sullen yet anxious expression. Mike soon notices, and says he is sorry they are in a team together, but affirms that he is certain she will get through, to which Steve simply replies, "Which one?" Both men stay quiet, as they look for Conkers upon the trees and ground, and they collect 2 each over the next few minutes. Steve then stops, holds up his Conkers, one of which is considerably larger, and claims he can never find a perfect pair. Coming to a stop in front, Mike points to Steve's larger Conker and chuckles, "Bigger isn't always better." With a delayed grin, Steve asks in return if this is what he says to all the girls. The pair laugh and continue making more puns about the size of their Conkers, until the guard shouts at them to pack it in and stop fannying around. This choice of words causes both Mike and Steve to turn to each other, then laugh again, but the guard impatiently takes out her handgun, and their laughter comes to an abrupt halt. Returning to their earlier demeanours, they are made to march on through the forest. At this time, Diane and Mary are trudging through the paths of a shallow bog on the opposite western side of the forest. Whilst Mary occasionally treads upon and picks up conkers from within the mud, Diane begins to complain that they were misled and tricked into forming a team. Within 10 seconds of hearing this monologue, the assigned guard impatiently whips out her handgun and shoves it into the back of Diane, who shrieks and trips against a tree. Mary appears unsure of what is happening or what she should do, and Diane grips onto the tree, with tears forming in her eyes. She shouts at Mary to run, and begins to do so herself, but the guard moves back and grabs Mary from behind, then brings the gun to the side of her head. Upon hearing Mary's panicked gasp, Diane turns back. The guard stoically informs that if she takes one step further, her teammate will be shot dead on the spot and she will be next. Mary tries to free herself, although the guard appears to anticipate this move and has her on the muddy ground in less than 2 seconds. The guard then declares how they have to do this properly. Diane steps back, but slips on the ground and rips off a branch from the tree as she collapses into the mud. She moans that she does not want to play these games anymore, and the guard fires back how this can so easily be arranged, before turning off the safety to her gun. Still lying in the mud, Mary shouts to not be a stupid cow. Diane shoots an exasperated look, yet Mary stands back up and reasons that if they follow the rules, at least one of them can live. Meanwhile, in the dense southern side of the forest, Alan, player 23, continues to sniff and sometimes sneeze from his blocked nose. The guard assigned to them repeatedly states that there is always something going around at this time of year, and on 3 occasions recommends drinking tea with honey. Alan nods politely whenever this is said, and he begins to collect some larger conkers as they travel down a steep hill and deeper into the forest. Yusuf, player 28, walks slightly behind, and with a lack of care, he plucks conkers from the branches and ground. He seems far more focused on the deeper forest to their left, even though there is little he can see through this opaque barrier of woodland. Without looking, Yusuf picks a final conker from a branch. The voice of Miss Green then sounds from several speakers dotted within the forest around them, declaring that players have 1 minute left to collect their 3 conkers. She also instructs all guards to stop their teams from travelling any further, and for the games to be played in their current positions. Over the next minute, most players have a final search within their surroundings for any conkers that are bigger or denser than those they have already collected. When the timer reaches 0, Miss Green orders for the games to be prepared. The guards take each conker and drill a hole through its centre, before feeding through a piece of string and forming a knot on the other side. Players are given back their newly prepared conkers, and when the last of the 17 circle guards has used a radio to confirm they are ready, a final announcement begins from the speakers. Players are informed that they have 1 hour to complete the game. The circle guard's watches automatically start counting down from an hour-long timer, and the game commences. Within the central clearing, Square Guard looks up to the electronic timer on a tree behind him. He turns back to the Triangle Guards and instructs each of them to head into a different sector of the forest, in order to ensure that the games are being played fairly and securely. Mr. Yellow is sent up a muddy incline to the northwest of the clearing, whilst Mr. Orange is sent through a sparse area of woodland to the northeast. Mrs. Blue subsequently offers to head down a sloping decline to the southeast, whereas Miss Green travels southwest and quickly disappears through the dense forest beyond the clearing. Near the edge of the northern forest, bordering a sun-kissed meadow, the circle guard in charge of Tracy and Albert's game takes a pound coin from his pocket and holds it ready. Out of impulse, Tracy reaches her hand forwards, but the guard declares lady's choice. She stares at the coin for a moment until the guard asks, heads or tails? She stutters, heads, and the coin is tossed. When it lands on the guard's hand, he inhales, then announces that because it has landed on tails, player 34, Albert, will start the game. Tracy tentatively holds out one of her conkers by its string, allowing it to dangle as Albert prepares to strike with his own. He proceeds to take an accurate swipe against Tracy's conker, and she only just holds on with enough grip to stop it from falling to the ground. Albert hits her conker again, and recalls with a kind of fondness how in the autumn months, when he was a boy, he and his friends used to leave school the second they heard the bell, so they could go to the forest and take the best conkers they could find. Albert prepares for his third shot, and he adds that there would, however, always be someone who beat them to the best ones. Tracy's conker is hit with a final whack, which sees it break off its string. Albert smiles and reminisces how this game always brings back pleasant memories. Tracy seems dazed, but takes the 2 remaining conkers from her pocket. As she decides which to use next, the voice of Johnny, player 123, is heard shouting "Stamps" in the distance. Albert looks around with some annoyance, and Tracy initially appears confused, although when she pulls back her next conker, a meagre smile forms across her face. Meanwhile in the Western Forest, the game between Mary and Diane is about to begin on some dry land next to a scattering of sun-bathed puddles. Mary feels Diane's conker, then very carefully lines up her own. She has one more touch of Diane's before smacking its side with hers. Unaware that Diane's conker was slightly cracked before the game began, Mary takes 2 more timed and focused shots. On the final shot, Diane's conker breaks and crumbles to the ground. She gasps in disgusted fear, and Mary cautiously asks if she just broke this conker. The guard responds that this is correct. Mary frowns and inquires if it was already damaged. Diane warily replies how she thought the cracks would make her conker stronger, as it has taken more damage. Mary gives a weak smile and replies that conkers are not like people. Diane then takes her 3 turns, but fails to hit Mary's conker at all, which causes her to curse this game and spit on the ground. Play passes back to Mary, who begins with an accurate shot against Diane's second conker. Diane's eyes open with worry as Mary feels this conker again. Mary is about to swing her conker forward when Diane moves the string a little to the side, which causes only the side of her conker to be brushed. The guard slowly turns to look straight at Diane, who knowingly glares back. It is then Mary's 3rd turn of this round, and she feels Diane's conker once more. However, this time, when Mary is about to swing her conker forward, Diane does not move her own and allows it to be hit, although no major damage seems to be caused. Play transfers to Diane, who is about to swing her conker forward, when they hear the voice of Squareguard from the nearest speaker, announcing that player 141, the young woman with dark crimped hair, is eliminated, whilst player 191, Charlie, has passed this game. Diane quivers. Already? Then a distressed wail and gunshot are heard in the distance. Nicholas and Jeff have been playing for a few minutes within the dense woodland of the forest's southern side, yet neither of their conkers appear to have sustained any damage. After finishing his 3rd shot, Jeff decides to remove his jacket. As he turns to lie it across some fern, Nicholas shoots a brief grin to the guard, who subtly nods back. Nicholas begins his next turn, accurately hitting Jeff's conker. He is about to take his 2nd shot, when Jeff asks what exactly happened to Joanne in yesterday's game. Nicholas inhales as he looks Jeff in the eye. He then takes his 2nd shot, which causes a loud crack. After taking a closer look at Jeff's conker, he responds that after Joanne was pushed out of the treehouse, she was unable to get back up in time to save herself. Jeff immediately asks who pushed her. Preparing for his 3rd shot, Nicholas shrugs that he is not sure, but he cannot feel any ill will against this person, as they have all done what was needed in order to survive. Nicholas smacks his conker down onto Jeff's, producing another loud crack. Play transfers to Jeff, who takes his 1st shot and says that Silver told him to be careful who he trusts in this game. Nicholas replies with a thoughtful grin how these are wise words. Only the distant sounds of nature are heard during Jeff's next 2 shots. Nicholas is about to take his 1st shot of the next round, when Jeff said he heard from someone who watched her die that it was Nicholas who pushed Joanne from the treehouse. Nicholas lets his conker go and misses Jeff's. He angrily tuts how this distraction has just caused him to miss. Before Jeff can respond, Nicholas claims that furthermore, what he is saying is untrue, and asks if he is hearing it from that slapper he had in the toilet last night. Jeff replies how slapper or not, she was a first-hand witness. Nicholas shakes his head with a wry smile, and grips his conker with increasing force in his fingers, until he strikes it forward. The resulting impact detaches Jeff's string from his hand. As the string and conker fall to the ground, Jeff shouts, "No stamps." At the exact moment, Nicholas shouts, "Stamps." Before the guard can say anything, Nicholas stamps his heel onto Jeff's conker. Jeff is clearly disgruntled, but remains calm and affirms that he shouted no stamps. The guard looks towards the smashed conker, and Jeff continues to complain until she catches Nicholas's eye. The guard slowly shakes her head and tells Jeff that as his conker is already destroyed, they will continue. He yells how this is unfair, but she raises her gun and orders him to remember where he is. With a dissatisfied scowl, Jeff steps back. The guard informs that it's his turn, and he takes out his conker, exhaling deeply as he prepares to use it. After just a few seconds, Nicholas politely asks for Jeff to hurry up with his turn, so they don't run out of time. He glares back to Nicholas, then with gritted teeth, smacks his conker forward. A moment later, in a dry, stony incline of the forest's eastern side, Steve's first conker is cracked off its string by Mike. With a hardened face, Steve blinks at the remnants of his conker, and Mike says, "Unlucky son." Steve then takes out his 2 remaining conkers, one of which is a medium size, while the other is much smaller but nearly the same weight. Steve raises them up to the rays of sunlight emanating through the tops of the trees. Noticing from the corner of his eye that Mike is watching, Steve pockets the smaller of his conkers and notices a quick smile form on Mike's face. The men look each other in the eye, and Mike quickly stops smiling, but Steve puts the medium-sized conker back into his pocket and takes out the smaller one again. Mike maintains a sportsman's grin as his conker is hit on all 3 of Steve's turns over the next round. However, he struggles to keep this positive demeanour when he only manages to hit Steve's small conker once over his turn, even whacking himself in the throat on his 3rd shot. Mike leans over and gasps for breath. Steve approaches, asks if he's okay, and pats him on the back. Yet when Mike proceeds to cough out phlegm, an expression of hopeful relief appears across Steve's face. Beside a rocky stream in the southwest of the forest, Yusuf and Alan have experienced trouble hitting each other's conkers and are therefore both still using their first. After Alan accidentally hits his own shoulder, the guard sits down on a large flat stone by the water and jokes that they will still be here in the new millennium if they carry on like this. Alan sneezes and shoots an uneasy smile to the guard, who proceeds to laugh loudly at his own joke. For his second shot of this round, Alan is more careful and manages to brush his conker past the side of Yusuf's, but it circles back and narrowly avoids his own nose. Alan is about to take the last of his 3 shots when Yusuf suggests making this game easier for them both. The guard watches as he wraps the string of his conker several more times around his hands, which Alan copies, causing their conkers to dangle closer to their hands. Alan then takes his 3rd turn, directly hitting Yusuf's conker this time. The game continues, and both men's accuracy increases, although their conkers remain intact. After a few more minutes, Yusuf takes the 3rd shot of his turn, but unlike the 2 shots before, he accidentally scrapes Alan's already grazed knuckle. Play transfers to Alan, who is preparing his conker, until Yusuf spots that the wound across his knuckle is bleeding. Alan is about to let his conker go, when Yusuf backs away and shouts to stop. The guard scurries to his feet, asking what's going on, and Yusuf explains that they need a plaster. However, Alan remains ready to take his shot and pleased to continue the game. Yusuf steps back even further when Alan pulls up his t-shirt and brings its lower half to his mouth. He then rips into it with his canine teeth and yanks away a strip with his other hand. Yusuf watches with ongoing surprise as Alan wraps this shred of fabric around his bleeding knuckle and ties it tightly with silent determination. He looks back to Yusuf and asks for them to get on with it. Yusuf remains silent and dangles his conker. Alan focuses, then hits with enough force that cracks form across both conkers. He is about to take another shot when they hear a shudder-inducing cry for help upstream, followed by a thundering gunshot. Both Yusuf and Alan remain rooted to the ground as it is announced that player 125, the woman with the half ponytail, is eliminated, whilst player 53, the woman with the blonde quiff and chunky glasses, has passed this game. Without wasting another second, Alan jolts round, grits his teeth, and knocks his conker into Yusuf's. He struggles to breathe as snot drops from his nose, and Yusuf looks concerned. Yet Alan does not hesitate to take his final shot of this round, smashing his conker against Yusuf's with such power that both conkers shatter to the ground. Yusuf mutters in confusion, and Alan swears loudly. Over the last few turns, Tracy has struggled to even hit Albert's first conker, let alone crack it. After having her second conker whacked with enough force for it to swing up and hit her in the jaw, she does not react to the pain, but instead asks Albert what happened to his eye. The guard turns to Tracy, yet she ignores him. Albert takes a shot and willingly answers that he had an infection a few years back. He then shares how his wife nursed him through it, and she might have stopped him from losing both eyes. As Albert prepares his conker for another shot, he recalls how he met his wife at the age of 12 when he played conkers against her brother. He pulls back his conker and is just about to let it go when Tracy jokingly asks if his conker skills are what attracted to her. Albert misses, but lets out a modest chuckle and replies how maybe it is what made her notice him. Tracy responds that it is interesting how our brains work when we are young. Albert prepares for his final shot when Mr. Orange appears through the tree line and the guard calmly orders to hold the shot. Albert does as he is ordered and watches Mr. Orange approach through the trees. whilst Tracy slowly moves her conker almost 2 inches back, in line with Albert's remaining eye. When Mr. Orange is close enough, he orders them to continue as they were. Inhaling with a smile, Albert lets his conker go. However, it misses, not even hitting within an inch of Tracy's conker. Mr. Orange watches as play transfers to Tracy. She pulls her conker back very slowly, then slams it down onto Albert's, with enough force for the string to leave his hand, and the attached conker falls to the ground. Albert almost falls forward, but Tracy yells stamps, and stamps her foot onto his conker. Albert gasps, and with a furrowed brow, complains that he did not realize they were allowing these hijinks. The circle guard tells him to wait, then looks to Mr. Orange. Tracy watches intently, until Mr. Orange shrugs back to the circle guard, who proceeds to declare that this conker is now out. Tracy breathes out a sigh of relief, and Albert rolls his eye, muttering under his breath. Meanwhile, in the western side of the forest, Mr. Yellow watches from behind a tree to see Diane taking another shot and finally destroying Mary's first conker. Diane inhales with apparent exhaustion, and Mary comments with a grin how she seems to be getting the hang of this game. They continue taking turns with their second conkers, until a robin lands on a lower branch of a nearby tree and sings a merry tune. Mary is about to take her shot, but steps back, listens to the robin for a few seconds, and declares that maybe she should have had a guide dog. Diane frowns with intrigue, and Mary hesitantly informs how she used to be afraid of lots of animals, including dogs. She continues, however, that a few years ago, one of the sniffer dogs attached to her unit probably saved their lives by sniffing out a device planted near their vehicle. Mary cheerfully recalls that this dog, a golden retriever named Athena, took a liking to her for some reason, and she ended up becoming quite attached. Diane asks why Mary did not take her home as a guide dog after she turned blind, to which Mary presumptively responds how Athena still had a job to do in the army. Mary's about to take another shot when Diane's face lights up, and she states that if Mary does ever get a guide dog, they should visit her down in Devon, as her house has plenty of land for a dog to run around and explore. A distant gunshot then sounds, and it is announced that player 82, the teenager with a well-coiffed afro, is eliminated, whilst player 37, Colin, has passed this game. Mary turns with an ironic smile to Diane, whose hopeful expression quickly fades. Diane apologizes how she was not thinking, but Mary says not to worry. Diane exhales, then smacks her conker down onto Mary's, causing a crack to form across its top. In the dense southern forest, Nicholas takes the third shot of his turn against Jeff, who steadily glares back, although the intended eye contact is not met. Play returns to Jeff, and Nicholas allows his conker to dangle. Yet before Jeff takes his first shot, he asks if Nicholas thought Joanne was just a slapper as well. Nicholas sighs irritably, and asks in return why Jeff keeps going on about her. Jeff says nothing, and Nicholas asks if he is going to take his turn any time today. Jeff continues to stare, and he waits a few more seconds. Nicholas exhales, and finally looks up to Jeff's eyes. The grin fades from Nicholas's face. After letting out a brief cough, Nicholas stoically declares that Joanne did not deserve the money as much as he does. Jeff's eyebrows rise, and Nicholas looks back to the conkers, rattly asking if he can get on with the shot. Without hesitation, Jeff demands to know why Nicholas thought Joanne did not deserve the money. The guard approaches and begins to order Jeff to hurry up. However, Nicholas holds his hand up to her and snaps that he highly doubts Joanne went through the mind-numbing, humiliating cycle of job centre visits, pointless interviews, which are over before they even begin, and the complete and utter filth which he has over the last year. Jeff snarls back that Nicholas knew very well how Joanne paid her way, and she would have faced just as many challenges as he did, if not more. Nicholas grunts how Jeff knows nothing about the challenges he has faced in his life, before barking at the guard to move the game along. After having a gun pointed to the side of his head, Jeff begrudgingly takes a firm shot with his conker and claims he is familiar with people like Nicholas, who don't realise they are just as bad as the people they look down upon. As Jeff takes his second shot, he continues through gritted teeth that he does not even judge Nicholas for killing Joanne, but he does judge him for not having the balls to admit he is playing dirty, when there are others in this game who've needed to take shots below the belt. The guard turns off the safety to her gun, yet Jeff ignores her and persists that a lack of hope for the future can result in people needing to take desperate actions. He growls that he sees it every day, and there is no point studying bloody Pythagoras when any parents you have left are in the dole queue, and you know you're headed there next. He spits to the ground, then adds that a crowbar and unattended car are probably much more appealing. Nicholas silently seethes, and Jeff snarls how he is not the only person who has faced hard times. The guard smacks the side of the gun against Jeff's head, cutting him off. He feels his ear in pain, but before he can even take his third shot, the guard orders Nicholas to take his turn. Jeff is too focused on the pain in his ear to notice he has not taken his third shot. Nicholas affirms that he will not be judged, then smacks his conker onto Jeff's, which finally breaks and shatters into pieces. Nicholas betrays subtle joy until Jeff grabs onto his conker. Nicholas tries to pull it back, but Jeff grips on, bringing it to his nose. He sniffs and claims he thought he could smell vinegar. Nicholas yanks it from Jeff, who grimaces, then turns towards the guard and scoffs. With an expression of unwillingly deep thought, Jeff takes out his final conker. As he dangles it before himself, Nicholas nods to the guard. Jeff notices this look and frowns, but just when he is about to turn round, the guard grabs him tightly from behind and brings a rag to his mouth. He wrangles his body about in an attempt to free himself from her grip, yet this movement falters within seconds and stops completely soon after. After observing the game between Johnny and player 56, the young man with dark skin and big brown eyes, in the eastern forest, Mr. Orange checks his screen device and heads south. Within minutes, he reaches a boggy stream, then waits behind a large tree stump. He proceeds to watch players 132, the middle-aged man with bushy eyebrows, and 138, the overgrown middle-aged man, struggling to hit each other's conkers on the other side of the stream. Player 138 suddenly turns and retches against a nearby chestnut tree. Mr. Orange sniggers under his breath and appears ready to move on, until he sees Mrs. Blue coming out from behind a tree on the other side of this game. Mr. Orange ducks down and peeps out from behind a tree stump to see Mrs. Blue taking charge and giving both players advice. He then creeps away and travels due south, through the surrounding forest, in order to pass this game without being seen. However, while Mrs. Blue is ordering both players to wrap their conker strings around their hands, Mr. Orange slips against a small muddy puddle and finds himself grabbing onto a bristly tree. A painful grunt is heard as Mr. Orange's face hits against this tree, followed by a squawking flight of pheasants from its branches. They fly just meters over the game between players 132 and 138, and Mrs. Blue looks round to where the gasp and birds came from. She seems transfixed for a few seconds before letting out a pensive hum. The circle guard asks if there is an issue, but she shakes her head and calmly responds that everything is fine. Player 138 finally manages to scrape player 132's conker and lets out a loud, victorious cheer. Mrs. Blue takes the circle guard to the side and whispers to just make sure that one of the Chuckle brothers is dead before the end of the hour. He asks in surprise if they are brothers, yet Mrs. Blue is already walking away. She proceeds to head south through the forest, being careful to move as quickly as possible in the direction of the grunt she previously heard, without making too much noise. After nearly 2 minutes of walking south, Mrs. Blue spots the outline of Mr. Orange's cobalt jumpsuit as he travels down the sloping riverbed of the eastern forest. Keeping a safe distance, she continues to follow him. Alan and Yusuf continue to play with their second conkers by a rocky stream in the southern forest. The former fights through several more bouts of coughing and sneezing, although he remains focused. Play passes to Yusuf, but before he could take a shot, Alan blows his nose with the tissue that the guard has given him. After sniffing and exhaling a little more, he puts the tissue away and presents his conker. Instead of taking a shot, Yusuf observes Alan's pale face and asks if he is going to be coughing and sneezing for the rest of his life. Alan looks into Yusuf's eyes, then back down to their conkers, and responds that it depends if he's still alive in 1 hour's time. Yusuf begins to apologize, saying this was a stupid question, yet Alan nervously chuckles that he understood what he meant. Yusuf takes an accurate shot, and Alan explains how if he lives beyond this game and somehow makes it out of here alive, he and his boyfriend will travel to America and get the medication they need. Without looking, Yusuf hits down his conker and responds that he did not know Alan had a boyfriend. Yusuf is about to take his third shot when Alan hesitantly explains how he is unsure if they are really in a relationship. Yusuf frowns, but Alan musters a weak smile and gently claims that he would like to live long enough to find out at least. He sniffs pensively, and Yusuf regards him, before looking back down and taking his third shot. Play then passes to Alan, who asks Yusuf what he would do with the money if he won. Yusuf seems to be thinking, and so Alan takes the first shot, accurately hitting his conker. As Alan prepares for the second shot, Yusuf screws up his face in thought and stutters that he is not sure. Alan holds back his conker and asks if Yusuf has not even thought about the money, but he replies with an ironic grin how he has had other things on his mind. A second later, it is announced from the speakers that player 16, the mousy young woman with delicate glasses, is eliminated, whilst player 14, Richard, has passed this game. A shot is heard to their east, followed by a painful screech and cry for mercy, which is truncated by 2 more shots. Alan shudders and looks away. The guard stands back up and claims that this experience puts everything into perspective. He points in the direction of the shot and states that they were told in their briefing this morning how 16 was the youngest player remaining, and today was her 18th birthday. Alan and Yusuf both look on in disbelief, and the guard mutters that he should not have told them this. He hurriedly asks them to keep this under their hats, and Alan nods in agreement, although Yusuf continues to stare quietly in the direction of player 16's scream. Alan's expression remains solemn, but he grips his string even tighter. The guard apologizes and says he does not wish to hold them up. With his conker still held out, Yusuf swears under his breath. Alan lets out a loud grunt and smacks down his conker once more. Meanwhile, near the meadow in the northern forest, Tracy and Albert are still playing with their second conkers. Tracy continues to move her conker mere centimetres back and forth within Albert's eye line, which causes him to hit it with diminishing frequency and accuracy. Albert becomes more exasperated until he misses all 3 of his shots in a row. He suddenly swears, spits to the ground, and grumbles to Tracy that he can still see what she is doing, even if he is missing an eye. The guard orders for play to pass to Tracy, and Albert asks if she knew they were going to be playing conkers. She says nothing, but pulls back her conker as far as possible and hits it straight down onto Albert's, which breaks off the string. With the empty string in his hand, he shudders and tries to look into Tracy's eyes, although she stares straight to the shattered remnants of his conker. The guard instructs for play to pass back to Albert, who takes out his third and final conker. He continues to eye Tracy, yet she turns around and inhales gently as she looks up at the tweeting birds. She responds that she guessed they were playing with conkers when she saw the blind woman tread on one in the clearing. Tracy turns back round to see Albert frowning, and she reiterates how she has never played this game before. Albert grunts, and Tracy affirms that she had to give herself a chance to get through. Back in the hilly area of the eastern forest, Mike and Steve are using their second conkers, both of which now feature several cracks. Steve takes his first turn of the next round and hits Mike's conker, cracking off a small piece from its side. As Steve carefully times and targets his next shot, Mike watches with a focused frown and shudders when the impact causes a high-pitched crack. Steve readies his conker for the third shot, but just when he is about to let it fly, Mike grits his teeth and pulls his own conker back an inch. Steve misses and irately asks what he is playing at. Mike tries to argue that he did nothing, yet Steve forcefully tells him to put his conker back. This disagreement swiftly escalates, almost to the point of physical violence, and the guard steps in. She orders Mike to play fairly and put his conker out again, as he did indeed move it. Mike looks around with uncertainty until the guard takes out a gun and points it to his head. Taking a small stumble back, Mike addresses the guard as love and asks her to calm down. The guard does not move, but after hearing a deep breath beneath her mask, Mike unwillingly lets his conker dangle once more. Steve readies his own conker, then reminds Mike to play fairly, addressing him as son. Mike looks up in annoyance until a shot booms out to the south. Both men glance in this direction, and it is announced that player 161, the middle-aged man with empty eyes, is eliminated, whilst player 71, Silver, has passed this game. As Mike exhales, Steve does not hesitate to slam down his conker, with such force that Mike's shatters off its string. During this time, Mr. Orange has been travelling through the sparse southeastern sector of the forest, unaware that Mrs. Blue is still following. He remains focused on his device, which still displays the satellite map of the Circle Guard's positions. This allows him to travel close enough to each game to observe its progress, but not close enough for its participants to see him. After watching Lakshmi, player 148, struggling to use a conker with her bruised fingers, Mr. Orange advances to the west, and within minutes, he enters the stream-filled southern forest. He passes another game, and only has a quick look from a distance before moving on. Mr. Orange begins to move faster, pacing between the water and trees, until he hears a series of snapping twigs echo just 20 metres to the south. Without thinking, he ducks behind a thick tree, and listens to the sound of cracking twigs passing. After a few seconds, he peeks out from behind the tree to see a figure in a cobalt jumpsuit to the south, walking east through the forest. Mr. Orange moves round the tree and peeks out from the other side to see the green triangle on this guard's mask. He inhales with pleasure and inconspicuously creeps south towards Miss Green, darting between the trees until he is just meters behind her. At this moment, Miss Green comes to an abrupt halt and starts to turn around, when Mr. Orange runs up behind and shouts, "All right, darling," as he grabs onto her. Miss Green yelps and lashes out. She suddenly finds herself sprinting to the south, while Mr. Orange chases and shouts that it's him. Just as Miss Green reaches the top of a dampened bank, she seems to realise this is Mr. Orange. However, before she could slow down, she slips and stumbles down the bank, eventually landing by a large rock near the stream. Miss Green grunts in pain and whips round to see Mr. Orange carefully making his way towards her down the bank. He apologises when he reaches her, but she interrupts, heavily chastising him and claiming he is lucky that she did not smack her head on a tree. Mr. Orange repeats how he did not mean to scare Miss Green. He puts out a hand to help her, which she rattly accepts. As Miss Green rubs the excess dirt off her jumpsuit, Mr. Orange comments that she will be fine. He tries to take her into his arms, although she seems resistant and turns away. Once Miss Green has finished rubbing the dirt from her jumpsuit, Mr. Orange whispers how they are all alone now. She jolts around and fires back that this is true, so she could shoot him in the head this instant, and nobody would know. Mr. Orange chuckles and concedes how this is also true, but people would hear the shot, whereas nobody would hear a thing if he strangled her to death right here and now. Miss Green sniggers that she would like to see him try. Mr. Orange steps towards her, and with a humorous tone claims all this talk has got him hot and heavy. Mr. Orange wraps his arms around Miss Green. She giggles, but releases herself from his grip, and states that they need to check on the other games. Mr. Orange begs, "Come on," and reminds how last night at the party, Miss Green agreed to have some alone time with him if they could. She exhales, and he agrees that this might be their only opportunity. Shots sound to the northeast, and it is announced how player 138, the overgrown middle-aged man, is eliminated, whilst player 132, the middle-aged man with bushy eyebrows, has passed this game. Mr. Orange points to the nearest speaker and confidently reasons that everything is fine and dandy. He takes Miss Green into his arms once more, and she lets out an amused gush of air beneath her mask, but asks what would happen if they got caught. Mr. Orange fires back that they won't, as there's an entire fucking forest for them to hide in. He then runs his hand up Miss Green's back and asserts how they are the ones with power, so they can do what they want. Miss Green breathes in as Mr. Orange runs his hand higher, feeling the nape of her neck beneath the hood of her jumpsuit. She tells him to say this again. Mr. Orange pulls Miss Green close to his body and whispers into her ear that she has the power. She lets him feel her neck and runs his hand down to the tip of her breast. Miss Green continues to take in jagged breaths as Mr. Orange explores her body with his hand. After 7 passionate seconds, she suddenly stops him and says there is a covered bit of stream back the way she came. Miss Green grabs Mr. Orange's hand and pulls him to the west. They proceed to move quickly along the side of the stream, while Mrs. Blue continues to watch from behind a nearby oak tree. Meanwhile, at the edge of the northern forest, Tracy is using her second conker to hit Albert's third. Every time his conker is about to be hit, he winces with a widening eye, although whenever it withstands the impact, he lets out a puff of air before bracing himself once more. Play passes to Albert, and he takes 2 turns, only clipping Tracy's conker. He breathes in deeply, grits his teeth, and takes his third shot, which finally puts a dent in her conker. A ray of hope appears across Albert's face, and he is about to ready his conker again, when the guard reminds that he has taken his 3 shots, which means play now passes to Tracy. The hope in his face then disappears as quickly as it appeared. Tracy adopts a focused expression and pulls back the string of her conker. Albert nervously holds out his own for the next few seconds, until he looks to Tracy's face and notices a tender smile forming. Albert's hands start to tremble, which causes his string to wriggle a little. Yet before Tracy can release her conker, Squareguard's voice sounds from the speakers, announcing that player 56, the young man with big brown eyes, is eliminated, whilst player 123, Johnny, has passed this game. A hopeless yell of protest sounds less than 100 meters away, followed by a booming gunshot, which launches an armada of birds towards Tracy and Albert's game. Albert flinches and cowers slightly from the overhead flight of birds. Tracy looks up, then smacks down her conker, with enough force to knock the string out of his hand. Before Albert seems to realise what has just happened, Tracy shouts, "Stamps!" and crushes his conker beneath her foot. Albert gasps and pushes Tracy back, almost knocking her over. He frantically blurts, "No stamps!" yelling continually as Tracy looks to the guard. Before the guard can act, Albert argues how he was not ready, but Tracy retorts that he was holding out his conker and so he was ready. The guard takes out his gun and tears swiftly form in Albert's eye. He lunges forth to slap Tracy, although he jumps back and is only scraped across the chin. Albert swears under his breath, then begins to charge at Tracy, when the guard grabs onto his jacket, which holds him back. He jerks around in disbelief, and the guard relays the number 34 into his radio. Albert frees his arms from the jacket and tries to run, but the guard turns off the gun's safety and orders him to stop. He comes to a gradual standstill and looks back, tearfully begging for one more chance, and trying to reason that the game was harder for him than everyone else. Seconds later, it is heard through the speakers that player 34 is eliminated, whilst player 26 has passed this game. Albert looks desperately to Tracy and pleads for help, but her eyes fall to the ground. Albert holds up his hands to the guard and begs to not be killed. Tracy turns round and stares up to the trees. Then a second later, she hears a shot, followed by a rustling clunk as Albert's body drops to the ground. She shudders and stares at the branches of the surrounding trees, which are now empty. The guard then orders her to come with him. Tracy hesitantly walks away with the guard until she looks back to Albert's corpse and notices his wide-open, bloodshot eye. She tells the guard to wait and jogs back. He seems confused and takes out his gun, but relaxes when he notices that Tracy is only closing Albert's eye. She whispers, "Sorry," then returns to the guard. Whilst Tracy is escorted back to the clearing, Diane and Mary are still hitting each other's second conkers within the western forest, although Mary's now has 2 independent cracks. Diane focuses as she lines up her conker. Seeming confident with its placement, she lets it go, and Mary's conker gently cracks off its string. Diane looks down, mumbling that she's sorry, but Mary stares ahead and calmly exhales. The guard orders play to pass back to Mary, who asks if they can take a small break. The guard seems unsure, but Diane reasons how there is still plenty of time left for them to finish the game. Following a moment of thought, the guard nods and approves this break. Diane leads Mary to a dry patch of grassy earth next to a tree. They sit down, and Mary gives a weak, uncertain smile as Diane looks around in a quiet daze. Mary runs her hand up the tree's bark and comments that she can never remember tree names. Diane looks over and begins to reply when Mary suddenly holds up her other hand for silence. Diane stops talking, and the guard puts a hand on her gun. A woman's sexual moaning slowly increases in volume and soon becomes audible to the north. Diane lets out a bemused smile, and Mary looks to her with a confused grimace. Diane notices Mary's expression and bursts out laughing, which in turn causes Mary to giggle. After almost 20 seconds, their laughter begins to subside, although this causes the moaning to be heard again, this time at an even higher pitch, and the laughter continues. Mary asks who's having a quickie, and Diane listens with a smirk. After a few seconds, she says it must be Kelly the singer, player 189. Diane adds that Kelly's teammate is most likely the chap she's always with, Scott, player 197, and by looking at them, you would guess they were already married. Mary smiles and exclaims how, to be fair, they're making the most of their time together. Diane turns to Mary and asks if blind sex is better than regular sex, with such bluntness that even the guard jolts round. Mary laughs and answers how they both have their pros and cons, but since she has turned blind, it is more vivid, which she eventually says after struggling for the right word. Diane appears intrigued, and Mary briefly explains how you might be down one sense, yet your other form make up for it. Mary grins, then asks what the best sex is that Diane has ever had. Diane gasps, and looks to Mary, who insists she owes an answer too. Unaware that the guard is also listening, Diane shakes her head with amused surprise, and eventually responds that she had a nice time with her ex-boyfriend when he took her to Paris last summer. Mary dryly responds, "City of love, innit?" And Diane gives a coy nod of the head. Mary waits for Diane to give more detail, but she says nothing more. With a hesitant drone, Mary responds, "Okay," and asks what the worst sex is she ever had. Diane sniggers, gives a pensive look upwards, and answers that it was probably when she lost her virginity at school. Mary frowns and Diane recalls how one day she decided she wanted to get it out the way. Therefore, when she was supposed to have geography for period 3, she asked a boy in her class to skip the lesson with her and come to her dorm, as she knew this was the only time she would be able to sneak him in and have the room to herself. Mary dryly comments, "romantic," and Diane continues how even though it was 2 minutes of crappy fumbling, she does not regret skipping that lesson. After letting out a splutter of laughter, Mary chuckles that Diane is the poshest person she's ever met. Diane smiles patiently and explains how even though this might sound pathetic, being at boarding school is like being in an inescapable prison, so it felt good to break the school rules and live a little for once. Mary chuckles and sarcastically asks what other school rules she wanted to break. Walking across the grass, not curtsying in the chapel, wearing the wrong shaped stockings. Although Mary laughs again, Diane snaps that she could joke all she wants, although to this day, nobody from her school even knows about what she just told Mary. Diane then huffs and claims she chose to share this story as she thought they were friends, or at least something close to that. Mary's laughter decelerates, and her face begins to fall. Diane adds that she may not have had exciting adventures in the army or tales of tantric sex, but she wanted to share a time when, for once in her life, she actually felt something. As Mary hesitates and begins to apologize, Diane shouts over her how having money is all good and fucking well, as long as you're in the right mind to use it. She then asks, though, if Mary realizes what it's like to have parents who pour money into you like a bloody investment and make you live a life you don't want from the age of fucking 5. Mary mutters an apology, but Diane asks if she knows what it feels like, knowing you're going to break like a glass piggy bank. Following a silent pause between them, Diane blurts out that her parents never even asked if she actually wanted to go to boarding school. Mary turns towards Diane as she jokes how they sent her away and did not care if she would miss them. Mary is about to put out a hand when a tear forms in Diane's eye, and she lies back against the tree, remarking that they clearly didn't miss her. After a moment's silence, Mary cautiously puts out a hand to Diane and apologizes for being a silly cow, adding that this was a shirty way to react. Diane appears unsure about accepting this apology, until she glances down through her tear-soaked eyes to the shattered conker pieces on the ground ahead. She slowly takes Mary's hand and thanks her. Mary carefully puts her arm over Diane's shoulder, and they look ahead in silence, until Mary asks if the guy in her geography class was attractive at least. Diane gives a neutral shrug, although she then comments how she does remember he had a mole shaped like a giraffe on his, willy. Mary immediately struggles to contain her laughter, which soon comes flying out, and Diane finds herself laughing too. Once Mary has caught her breath, she shouts, "Willy!" and bursts out laughing that Diane is posh as fuck. Diane does not protest, but lets out a grin. Another shot booms out and the laughter suddenly ceases. It is then announced that player 67, the lanky man with withered skin, is eliminated, whilst player 35, the woman with gaping eyes and a smattering of tattoos, has passed this game. The guard approaches Mary and Diane and suggests they carry on with their game, as they have now used half their time. Mary closes her eyes and her face falls. With a bittersweet smile, Diane wipes away her tears, then puts out a hand to help Mary to her feet. Meanwhile, in the southern forest, Jeff comes to and blinks sporadically until he realizes that his neck, waist, and wrists are tied around a tree by a series of ropes. He starts breathing out in a panic and begs for help. On the other side of the tree, Nicholas finishes speaking to the guard and ambles round with a sharp knife at the ready. Jeff's eyes widen, but he controls his breathing and boldly snarls that he knew what Nicholas's game was during Bulldog when he convinced everyone to move at the start of the second round before being conveniently knocked over. Nicholas kneels down to Jeff's level and responds with an understanding smile that he did not deserve to be eliminated so early in this game, and the people needed someone to take charge. Nicholas maintains a positive expression and tells Jeff to make himself useful. Jeff screws up his face, and Nicholas asks what he knows about Tracy, as any information would be much appreciated. Nicholas waits with a patient smile, and Jeff looks him up and down, then spits in his face. Nicholas wipes away the spit and shakes his head before slapping his hand across Jeff's face. With a red mark forming across his cheek, Jeff sniggers and tells Nicholas to go fuck himself. Nicholas pulls back his arm and is about to punch Jeff, when the guard shouts to stop, as too many facial injuries will look suspicious. Nicholas glares with a raised fist and appears tempted to launch it at Jeff's mouth, yet he slowly brings his hand back down and claws up some dry dirt instead, which hits Jeff's neck and face. Jeff breathes out through his nose and claims he does not even know who this Tracy lady is. Nicholas looks to him with impatience, then grumbles the Dossett in makeup. Jeff shakes his head and maintains that he does not know her. The guard steps in and quietly adds how there were several Dosses in makeup at yesterday's party. Nicholas sighs and looks back to Jeff, then asks for information on anyone he spoke to last night. However, Jeff sarcastically chuckles that he barely remembers the party and asks if Nicholas saw how much he had to drink. Nicholas appears pensive, but casually sits across from Jeff and asks if any other surviving player has mentioned an illness or weakness, or even just any bloody thing they don't like. Jeff gives another bewildered shake of the head, and Nicholas's eyes slowly form a glare. He then finds himself getting annoyed as he struggles to crack the last of his 10 knuckles. Although Jeff is still tied up and hurt, a slight grin forms across his face. Once Nicholas has finally managed to crack his last knuckle, he breathes in, addresses Jeff as old chap, and asks why this has to be so tedious when all he is asking for is a little nudge to the finish line. Jeff listens with a subtle scowl as Nicholas laments that he has had to go through 13 interviews in the last 2 months, and despite getting several callbacks, he has never managed to get a much-needed job, which has left him pretty sick and tired of second place. Jeff stoically responds how maybe Nicholas is just not good enough. Nicholas grits his teeth and claws his fingers, but he blinks twice, then asks what Jeff knows about that Chinese slapper. Jeff looks down, shakes his head, and explains with a resigned smile that he does not actually remember much of what she said about her life. Nicholas slowly removes the knife from his pocket, and Jeff eyes it carefully as he finds himself sitting up against the tree. Nicholas calmly moves the knife towards Jeff, who shakily asks the guard for help. He moves his head as far away from the knife as the rope will allow, but the guard simply watches. Nicholas gives a reassuring nod and encourages Jeff to think a little deeper, so that this does not have to get nasty. He then moves the knife towards Jeff's left eye. Jeff closes this eye, followed by the other, and bites down hard between accelerating breaths, until he blurts out, "Hong Kong." Nicholas frowns, and Jeff hurries to explain that Silver told him last night how she moved here from Hong Kong with her father in 1973 when she was 8 years old. Nicholas gives a brief smile and thanks Jeff, but requests that he think of something else which might actually be useful. Jeff shakes his head, and Nicholas impatiently brings the knife close to his eye. Jeff gasps and shouts out for help, yet Nicholas groans that nobody will hear him. He asks again for anything which could be used against Silver, and Jeff finds himself clamping his eyes shut, desperately thinking and breathing in haste. Nicholas holds the knife even closer, and snarls how Jeff is seriously testing his patience. Amidst a loop of desperate breaths, Jeff opens his eyes, gasps at the proximity of the knife, and yells that he cannot think of anything else. Nicholas huffs out impatiently, and Jeff begins to cry, calling him crazy and begging him to stop. Nicholas gets up and turns to the guard, saying that these were really simple instructions, and this did not have to end in tears. With a tear now flowing down his cheek, Jeff pleads even louder this time for Nicholas to stop. Nicholas calmly responds, "All right," and Jeff breathes out a sigh of relief, then asks if they can just finish the game. Nicholas does not answer, but approaches the guard with a nod, and she hands him her gun. Jeff looks up in disbelief and asks what's happening, until Nicholas turns back, revealing the gun in his hand. Jeff yells an objection, but Nicholas immediately fires 3 bullets into his chest. Jeff's body slumps against the tree, and Nicholas declares that this is the first time he has ever fired a gun. After a brief delay, the guard nods and relays into her radio that 173 has won. A moment later, it is announced through the speakers how player 171 is eliminated, whilst player 173 has passed this game. Nicholas thanks the guard, and she asks if he really had 13 interviews in the last 2 months. He nods sternly, then breathes out and looks up to the sky, sighing that he is indeed so tired. The guard says nothing, and after a few seconds, Nicholas looks back to her and asks how she would like to be Employee of the Month, or even Hero of the Hour. The guard asks what Nicholas means, and he shares his belief that another player is planning to sabotage their own game. The guard inquires what Nicholas knows, but he orders her to name a price. After some haggling in regards to the nature of this information, the £500,000 Nicholas was going to pay the guard is revised to £445,000, and she demands to hear what he knows. Nicholas then leads the way east, and informs that someone is planning on doing a runner to the mainland. The guard says this is not sabotage, but huffs out how it is pretty stupid with a kilometre of water in the way. Nicholas chuckles and simply replies how this player does not know that. As they walk away from Jeff's quivering body, it is announced through the speakers that player 83, a young man with a greying face and hair, has been eliminated, whilst player 127, the older West African man, has passed this game. Near the island's southern beach is a deep and dried-up section of the riverbed, bordered on each side by high banks, which allows for a natural hiding space from eyes beyond. Mr. Orange and Miss Green are rapidly becoming more intimate against one of these banks, delving their hands deeper and deeper into each other's jumpsuits. After little more than 2 minutes of this foreplay, Mr. Orange all but forces Miss Green to her knees. She then unzips his jumpsuit, pulling it down to reveal a plain black t-shirt over his torso, along with a pair of white nylon briefs at the top of his ivory legs. Mr. Orange takes a deep breath of excitement as Miss Green reaches inside his briefs. He tries to lift the bottom of the mask from her chin, but she quickly pushes his hand away and tells him to leave it. Mr. Orange shrugs and sniggers, then claims they won't be able to do anything if she has her mask on. Miss Green does not reply, but Mr. Orange assures that he will not be able to see her face from up here. Miss Green looks up with apparent hesitation, until Mr. Orange mutters, "Come on." She looks down and cautiously slides the mask so that it juts over her head, with her face still hidden from above. Mr. Orange whispers words of encouragement as Miss Green begins to pleasure him. His words morph into vocal joy, and he soon takes hold of Miss Green's head. Their intimacy continues until Miss Green seems to feel unease and tries to pull her mouth away, although Mr. Orange maintains a forceful grip upon her head. In fact, Miss Green is unable to free herself for almost 10 seconds, at which point she violently pulls back and splutters for breath, ordering Mr. Orange to stop. He tries to bring Miss Green's head back, but she insists that she needs some air and berates him for being too rough. Mr. Orange laughs in amusement, although upon hearing Miss Green's shallow breaths, he apologizes, explaining how he has not had any for a week. He looks down and observes Miss Green's freckled chin jutting down beneath her mask. She fires back that she's not had any action either, then emits a long, impatient breath. Mr. Orange agrees, apologizing once more. After letting out a sudden laugh, Miss Green leans back towards his groin and is about to continue what she started, when a scattering of earth falls onto her head from above. Miss Green grunts, and Mr. Orange asks what this was. They look up to see a small camera being held out over the bank above. Mr. Orange screams out a string of swear words, and the camera flashes, before being yanked out of view. In a panic, Miss Green asks if this was a camera, but Mr. Orange knees her away from his groin and rushes to zip up his jumpsuit. Miss Green demands to know what is going on, as Mr. Orange jumps up and grips onto a side of the riverbed. From here, he sees Mrs. Blue sprinting away from them to the west, with the camera gripped firmly in her hand. Mr. Orange screams at her to come back, calling her a fucking bitch. Still running away from them, she comes into view from the riverbed, and Miss Green also shouts abuse. Yet Mrs. Blue does not look back and runs on. As Mr. Orange climbs up from the riverbed, he knocks his knee against a jutting rock, which causes him to shout in pain when he begins to stagger after Mrs. Blue. She hears his approaching threats and turns round to see him pulling out his gun. She continues to flee, letting out a nervous squeal as she tries to pull out the radio from her jumpsuit. However, it falls to the ground before Mrs. Blue can use it. She comes to a sudden stop and seems to contemplate running back, but Mr. Orange is now less than 20 meters away, swearing and limping towards her with his gun in hand. Mrs. Blue gasps and turns to run into the thick bordering tree line, yet before she could do so, Mr. Orange aims his gun at her and fires. This shot is heard in the distance by Alan and Yusuf, but with both men now down to their third conkers, neither of them reacts. Alan pulls back his conker for the last shot of this turn, and exhales with pensive disdain before whacking it forwards. Yusuf's conker remains intact, and he stares into the nearby stream until the guard prompts that it is his turn. He looks up, as if in a daze, then steadily prepares his conker. Alan winces and seems to be fighting hard not to let his dangling conker be affected by his trembling hands. Yusuf pulls back his own and is about to take a shot when he looks towards the western tree line and frowns. The guard asks what is the matter, then looks in the same direction as Yusuf to see another circle guard approaching through the trees. Following 2 more gunshots and a scream to the east, Alan and Yusuf's guard calls out to this approaching guard, asking if everything is shipshape. Yet she cautiously beckons him over, and they begin to talk amongst themselves. Alan watches them, and nervously ponders what this conversation might be about, until he looks back to Yusuf's face, and notices the pale shade it has turned. Alan asks what's wrong. Yusuf says nothing as he watches Nicholas step out from behind a tree, at an angle which is only visible to Yusuf. Nicholas then gives him a knowing glare. Whilst Alan endures another sudden coughing fit, Yusuf glances back with concern to see the female guard, who was overseeing Nicholas's game, subtly gesturing in his direction and whispering to the male guard, who has been overseeing Alan and Yusuf's game. Yusuf breathes deeply, then he lets his conker fall behind his back, next to the stream. He turns and kneels down to pick it up, but also grabs a small yet heavy rock in his other hand, which he slides into his pocket. Alan watches with cautious intrigue to see the guards wrap up their discussion. The female guard then walks towards Yusuf, unholstering her handgun as she orders him not to move. When she is less than 2 meters from Yusuf, he pulls the rock from his pocket and charges forward, whacking it into the side of her head before she can lift her gun towards him. The guard shrieks, falls to the ground, and drops her gun, which bounces into the rocks by the stream. The male guard stumbles back in surprise, and Yusuf runs at him as well. He tries to take out the gun from his jumpsuit, although before he is able to, Yusuf pounces and brings him to the ground as well. Nicholas is still hidden behind a tree, but he and Alan watch in shock as Yusuf places his knees onto the male guard's arms, stopping him from moving. With a determined grunt, Yusuf grabs the radio from this guard's jumpsuit and smacks his rock down onto it, breaking it beyond repair. He then holds the rock next to the guard's head and orders him to take Alan back to the clearing immediately. The guard rapidly nods his head in obedience. Still clearly in pain, the female guard points to Yusuf and shouts for someone to get him. As she stumbles to her feet and tries to yank the radio from within her jumpsuit, Yusuf swears, then jumps up and runs towards Alan. He finds himself backing away, although Yusuf stops before him and declares, "Peace be upon you, brother." Yusuf shoves out his hand, and Alan appears gobsmacked, but Yusuf shouts, "Come on," and Alan gingerly shakes his hand. The female guard finally pulls out the radio from her jumpsuit, but it slips from her hand and falls in the stream. Without any further delay, Yusuf turns and sprints to the south. Alan watches with a shocked open mouth as Yusuf disappears into the tree line. Whilst the female guard irritably pulls out the radio from the water, the male guard sits up and asks what the dickens just happened. Alan gives an unknowing shake of the head, and the male guard hesitates, but gets to his feet and tells Alan to consider himself victorious. The female guard painfully nurses her bleeding head, and after checking her radio, she snarls how the stupid thing has stopped working. The male guard tells Alan that they had better head back to the clearing, as he needs to report this. Alan looks south into the forest, but timidly joins the male guard, who calls to the female guard to see the medic when they are back at the barracks. He also assures that he will report number 28, although the female guard now appears more focused on locating her gun. The male guard briskly leads Alan to the north, and they soon vanish through the tree line, whilst the female guard grips her head in pain with one hand and feels for her gun with the other. She spends nearly a minute faintly searching and mumbling to herself, until she hears the unclicking of the gun's safety from across the stream. She looks up to see Nicholas pointing the gun towards her head. She lifts her hand and begs for help, to which Nicholas simply mutters, "Dear, oh dear." The guard grimaces and feverishly mutters for help, but Nicholas takes a few steps round to her side, then fires a bullet into her temple. After rubbing down the gun and placing it in the now deceased guard's hand, Nicholas begins the walk north, back to the clearing. Meanwhile, Yusuf is running south along a forest path towards the beach. Several times he gasps and looks over his shoulder, but he keeps moving until he stumbles over the roots of a thick tree next to a steep ravine. He scarpers back up to his feet and takes deep breaths as he grips onto the tree. He looks ready to run on when a crackling of twigs sounds beyond some bushes to the right. Yusuf hurries to crouch within some nettles, gripping onto a protruding tree branch and being careful not to slip into the ravine to his left. He grips the rock in his pocket, and a few seconds go by, with little more sound than the sporadic cheeps and caws from the nearest birds. Yusuf peeks out from behind the tree. He sees nothing out of the ordinary, and slowly gets back up, being careful to avoid stinging himself on the nettles without slipping into the ravine. A bullet is then fired in his direction.